So the working definition, I call it a working definition because the original definition Raphael Lemkin took included a lot of different identity groups that should be protected. And then, of course, through UN meetings, it got smaller and smaller and smaller to the definition we have today, which was adopted in 1948. So in the UN Convention on the Prevention of Genocide, it says that genocide is the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a group of people based on ethnicity, nationality, race, or religion. So this is identity-based destruction. And it's those four groups: ethnicity, nationality, race, and religion. There are some obvious groups missing. Who do you think's missing? Gender. Gendercide, femicide. And what about politics? Can you be targeted for your political affiliation? Yeah, we don't need to look very far in the past or present to see that there can be extreme identity-based targeting based on political affiliation. So genocide today is a legal definition. It's a crime, which means that the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice are primarily the courts that prosecute individuals on the crime of genocide. But individual states can also prosecute on the crimes of genocide, and they have individual laws to do so. So what's the general landscape? Genocide is, on average, happening every 2.5 years.
Ew.
That was my reaction. This is the deadliest conflict of the 21st century that no one's talking about. It kills more people than climate change, kills more people than any other conflict, more than war, more than civil war, more than coup, more than anything else. Why are we not talking about this? That's the whole reason I started my organization, Bellwether International, in 2019. I was working for a charity in London that was responding to the Yazidi genocide. I'd never even heard of the Yazidis. And I'm very blessed with an education. I have had the privilege of working in Congress. And I'd never heard of this group. And then in 2017, the Rohingya in Burma were victims and are continuing to be victims of genocide. Then the Uyghurs in China. And now we're at a moment where Sudan and Palestine, among other nations at risk of genocide, are in the news and certainly on our mind. So it's very depressing outlook, but there is a piece of hope. Genocide is the only form of conflict that is completely predictable. Completely. Because it takes, on average, between 5 to 15 years to convince people to kill and be killed for their identity. It's not a crime that's intuitive. It's not natural for societies. It's not something that we devolve to. It has to be taught. It has to be reinforced with propaganda, with mass media campaigns. It has to be modeled by the top leaders of a society. We have to dehumanize a group, we have to scapegoat a group, and then there has to be mass impunity once violence starts happening against that group. So it's completely predictable. If something is completely predictable, it's completely preventable. It's completely preventable. So why haven't we successfully prevented genocide? Well, my persuasion, and now I am biased because I'm an economist, but my persuasion is that we've only taken a legal approach to genocide since the Holocaust. And while we need the law and while we need to prosecute criminals, the value of human life and the law doesn't necessarily motivate governments. What motivates governments? Money. So we need an economic approach to genocide prevention, which is the goal of Bellwether International. And once we have an economic model, which we're building with researchers out of MIT, that can predict genocide and see the early warning signs, then we need to be able to take an evidence-based approach to actually intervene and stop genocide and prevent genocide. That model will have a working prototype by the end of this year. With that model, the next step will be thinking about genocide prevention at scale. It's not going to be one organization. It has to be a lens that's adopted by people like you in this room. All of you are going to study different things, you're going to go into different jobs, you're going to go into different places, And just like climate change is a pair of glasses that we kind of put on to see the world. Okay, we're going to think about supply chain and climate change. We're going to think about severe weather events and climate change. We're going to think about immigration and climate change. We all need to put on the lens of genocide prevention. And in all of your jobs, you'll have a sphere of influence to say, hey, could this affect genocide? And that's how you all become bellwethers. A word that means to be a leader, to be an indicator of trends. In every flock of sheep, there's one bellwether sheep that has a bell tied around its neck. They help lead the way. You're the bellwethers of your community, of our nation, of our world. And if you adopt the genocide prevention lens, you become part of the solution to preventing genocide at scale. So there's a lot we can do. There's a lot of concrete things we can do, but I'm just going to give you 3 quick examples and then quickly pass off to my other speakers because I am really eager to learn from you all and really happy to be here. First, what people do you hate, or who are you taught to hate, or who do you joke about? Hatred. You all have heard this. I know you've heard this in your classrooms, on your sports teams. Oh yeah, he smells funny. That's because he's fill in the blank. Oh yeah, we don't really talk to her. She's a little slow, you know, she's from. You've all heard this. This is hatred. This is how we teach hatred. This is how we practice hatred. And that hatred takes lives in this country and in other countries. And we have an obligation to disrupt those cycles of hatred long before there's a scapegoat, long before it turns into something like genocide. So you need to watch and be aware of where hatred is being spread in your own life, who you're teaching to hate, right? Do you look at your social media feed? You're being fed information about who you should hate. Maybe it is the political party. Maybe it's the political party you're not a part of. Likely it is. Maybe it's a sports team, and maybe you think, no, I don't really hate them. Well, there are football stadiums and soccer stadiums around the world where hatred becomes so violent and intense. It's about identity.
Oh, yeah.
This is the thing that happens. So my first invitation to everyone in this room is to think about your sphere of influence, your teams, your classrooms, your family, your social media feed, and think about, am I maybe totally unaware that I could be spreading hate in my sphere of influence, in my circles? That's the first step to being a bellwether, and the first step to joining the genocide prevention movement. So now to my colleagues, and then I'll circle back with some other insights.
Good morning, and thank you for having me. It's really an honor to be here. I'm going to follow that with some reflections, if you will, on teaching and learning. I think we have a lot of learners here, probably teachers here, and of course we are always all learning. So each semester, when I teach this course on the Holocaust in film and literature, I assign a project in which students comparatively analyze another genocide in relation to the Holocaust. They think about what parallels and departures there are in the times before violence occurs. How were ordinary people, businesses, politicians, and others persuaded to cooperate, to collaborate? How did popular and political messaging dehumanize those targeted, and in many cases, moderates? How did the international community respond? After this project, it's not uncommon for students in their writing to reflect on that very familiar, self-evident truism that probably most of us learned in middle school or maybe even earlier. Those who don't learn from the past are doomed to repeat it. Invariably, students preface this with an apology for using such a tired old statement. But I think the subtext is clear. They're saying, we've all learned the same, which has become self-evident to us, but actually we haven't really learned it. I think their experience is common for anyone who looks at genocide comparatively. Certainly, this was my experience. And maybe especially when we look around in the present moment we realize the issue, when we feel horrified by its violation. I think there's a second realization here. The fact of the continuance of genocide brings an additional realization of its patterns, including the question of political and popular will to do anything. I think this connects to your statements. These two realizations emphasize another human reality, and this is another quote: "It's easier to cry than to change." These are realizations that I think we all need to experience, and by we, I mean beyond this room, we as human beings, if we are going to develop the habits of mind that can actually lead to actions, no matter how small or, as we are capable, large. Actions which push against the tide of rights deprivation. I think such realizations should be followed also by introspection. Of course, historical contexts vary greatly, but in times of instability and social division, conditions which might lead to genocide emerge. I'm not sure if there's a slide here. Oh, okay. Thank you. Slides. So there are a number of visuals that represent the sort of road to genocide, if you will. But I like the way Jamie Wise's pyramid model of genocide from last year emphasizes this. I think they'll get it in a moment. So the bottom part shows this, emphasizes the idea of what are the contexts in which the things that then lead to genocide occur. Sorry for the pixelization here. So in times of economic distress and all sorts of other chaos and upheaval, these are the conditions which often lead to a number of individual choices. A lot of these choices that you can see over here relate to manifestations of language. So things like dehumanization, scapegoating, labeling, hate speech, threats. So many that do relate to or are manifested, can be manifested in language. Indeed, it doesn't take much effort to think of examples of words that are doing those things right now. We might look at our social media posts, things that we scroll through, comments that we see all over the internet, maybe elsewhere, and of course, even in the rhetoric of elected officials both here and abroad. This brings us to another truism, another self-evident truth: words create worlds. Unfortunately, it seems that the internet and algorithms have especially contributed to the construction of limited and twisted worlds, which rest on half-truths and full falsehoods. After all, if I take in a certain messaging, I may not even realize how my world has been manipulated so that what was previously unjust and morally unthinkable, in my mind, now becomes just and even necessary. Perhaps I think of it even as brave and the right thing to do. In an NPR article just from yesterday when I was working on this, professors in Illinois whose lives have been impacted by reductive labeling of their research spoke about this very topic. After remarking on the number of emails and social media messages telling him to die, one Chicago professor said, quote, "It kind of is disappointing to see that there's no sense of baseline humanity that's granted to people with differing perspectives. One wonders if those expressing death wishes feel themselves to be acting justly. Through exposure to certain types of messaging, have they been convinced that some people do not share their humanity? This must be the case also for the person who wrote on another professor's, in an email to another professor, 'I'm going to rape you in front of your children.' What can be done? Certainly, I think we all need information literacy, an information literacy that considers the ways in which dehumanizing and scapegoating words are, in effect, creating our worlds. An information literacy which includes the implications of language in relation to both genocide and peace, as we see in Dr. Wise's other model. There's also a peace model that Jamie Wise created that is the inverse of this genocide model. Siblings Hans and Sophie Scholl, university students in Munich during the Nazi era, engaged in this type of consideration and determined that they had to push back with their own words against the lies of their time. They read and discussed novels and philosophy, and they found that Nazi propaganda presented a false world, one filled with destruction, and one completely at odds with the future that they longed for. Talk into the microphone. Oh, sure. Perhaps information literacy should also prompt metacognition, thinking about thinking, about the psychological and philosophical and emotional impact of rhetoric, of the use of language. What types of posts, videos, articles make me start to feel that my fellow humans ought to be killed or even raped in front of their children? Then do I see the connection between this and how it is that ordinary people go along with genocide? This sort of introspection would move these visuals beyond historical application in a way that could cause each of us who laments the genocides of the past to look closely at our own positions on who deserves human rights and who does not. Or as Hannah Arendt put it, who has the right to have rights? After all, it seems that sometimes we feel those who suffered in the past deserved human rights more than those in the present deserve them. Maybe because we can now see the false accusations, the dehumanization, the violence for what it was, an assault on humanity. But in this now, as alluded to above, accusations of radicalism, terrorism, etc., convince many that deprivation of rights is warranted and necessary. This is also, of course, freedom from responsibility. And here to make just one last point, a little bit about responsibility. Hannah Arendt, who I just mentioned, had something to say about responsibility. And this connects to the responsibility we take for the worlds that we are creating through the language that we are consuming. She argued that whether one thinks of mankind as a religious or humanistic ideal, such implies a common sharing of responsibility. As a result of the, what she called shrinking of geographic distances, which is even more so, of course, for us, in her time, this had suddenly assumed what she called a terrifying timeliness. She said, the idea of humanity purged of all sentimentality, meaning we're not being idealistic about human beings. We are messy. We are sometimes very unlikable, and we do terrible things. But take away the sentimentality that one might be inclined to have from a distance, and this idea of humanity has very serious consequences, that in one form or another, men must assume responsibility for all crimes committed by all men, and that eventually all nations will be forced to answer for the evil committed by all others. She concluded this thought, though, by saying that tribalism and racism are the very realistic and very destructive ways of escaping this predicament of common responsibility. To conclude, Arendt's use of this word responsibility stands out in its suggestion of kinship, care, and acceptance of burden. That is the predicament of responsibility, which pushes back against tribalism and racism. And it's this burden of responsibility that rejects the violence of that genocide model for this model of peace.
I want to begin today thanking our host, Elizabethtown College, as well as the World Affairs Council, for its invitation to speak on this important and current issue. I was honored by the invitation and at the same time felt a sense of duty to accept. I wanted to warn you that I am more of a writer than a speaker, and much less of an expert than I am a student of genocide. There are many scholars in genocide studies, historians, legal scholars, and political scientists who would qualify as experts before I ever did on the question of cyclical violence and genocide. But at the same time, this question won't leave me alone, and I felt it was my responsibility to pursue it. So here I am today. I'll try to keep these remarks as brief as possible, but I want to make 3 basic points that I believe entirely relevant to breaking the cycle of violence. The first, an abridged version of my own trajectory and main insights as a student of genocide, and what compelled me to go further each time. The second, something about the word genocide, its invention, its debated usefulness, and its contested use. And lastly, I want to segue into what's happening in the world today. And the daily news gives us ample to choose from, whether to address Gaza, the Sudan, or political violence and polarization in this very country. I am a student of genocide by accident of my birth to a father whose parents and sisters emigrated from Anatolia at the time of the Armenian genocide. Few today are old enough to remember campaigns across the United States to raise funds for the starving Armenians. They might have been admonished to finish what's on their plate because of the poor, starving Armenians. But mostly this event, sometimes mislabeled as the first genocide of the 20th century, is one most people know nothing about. It's in the past. It doesn't immediately concern us. Then again, another reason people know nothing about it is that this genocide has not been officially recognized by the Republic of Turkey. In fact, it has been consistently denied and contested. Now, as a young child, I knew about this word genocide, and I knew that my grandparents spoke Armenian, and that my aunts cooked amazing dishes, and that my father was made fun of in school for drinking spoiled milk, yogurt. I knew that something had happened, and that's why they were all in France, that my aunts had spent some time in an orphanage before my grandparents found them, that they had seen terrible things they would not share because I was too young. From my own experience, denial made no sense whatsoever. Why would peasants flee their homeland and choose to start over penniless as refugees in a foreign tongue and culture unless they had no other viable choice? Thus, I was aware of this word genocide very early on. I also grew up in Alsace, France, on the border next to Germany, so that it would have been impossible not to have heard of the Holocaust. And my Jewish friends and I had this sense of a shared knowledge about genocide, even though it was not central and forefront to our friendships. In other words, our knowledge meant that we were aware that genocide was not singular. It was catastrophic, horrific, but not unique. My 13-year-old self knew that, not as a school-aged child from her history class, but as a citizen of the world. I'll always remember the first time that my parents and I went together to visit the Struthof concentration camp, about 100 kilometers from my hometown. Not the least because we rarely did things as a family, so that this, they thought, had to be what family was for the hard times. I have visited other concentration camps since then, but this first visit encapsulates the biggest insights I've gleaned from the human tragedy that is genocide. The cruel juxtaposition of pragmatic life with the horrors of abuse, from reading about the ashes of cremated victims that prisoners would spread onto the frozen paths to prevent their SS guards from slipping, to the hotel and restaurant that sits right across from the former gas chamber and experimentation room, to the reality that this village could not be aware of what was happening up in the camp. Some insights are good to think, but this one undermines. It is a glimpse into the reality that the potential for this kind of violence is not exceptional. It is all too human. As a student of genocide, I understood without grasping entirely the role of denial on a psychological level. Remembering is painful, and we're all aware of the psychological concept of cognitive dissonance. It was years later, though, that I made a connection between denial, revisionist history, and national identity. To begin with, I was only concerned about the denial of the Armenian genocide. It baffled and infuriated me. But the more I read, the more I realized that denial itself is a paradigm in the cycle of violence, whether intentionally malevolent for the sake of a founding myth and a national identity, or a function of survival, as in the forgetting that misremembers, or yet again, the result of ignorance, sometimes willful. Here, I'll just say that genocide becomes essential to one's identity, first, to be sure, for any survivor, but for subsequent generations, this is not just an historical event, but a foundational one. To wit, I don't speak Armenian, and in terms of my ethnicity, I'm a mixed bag. Before I knew anything at all about Armenia, its foundational myth centered on Mount Ararat, where Noah landed the ark, the first Christian nation, its own alphabet invented for the sake of protecting its identity through foreign invasions and changing empires. Before any of these facts, I knew about the genocide and the diaspora. When I went to Yerevan, the capital of Armenia, and met with academics at the university, they insisted that we, the Armenians of the diaspora, were to this new Republic of Armenia as Jews across the world are to Israel. In virtue of the genocide, we were also always Armenian. We should care for the country. This was our duty. But while I cannot sit squarely with the logic of these academic patriarchs, the point is that Armenianness, whether perforce a diaspora identity as it is for me, or bound up with the homeland, is in both cases predicated on a genocide. Denial, then, of this genocide is denial of a core facet of one's identity, is itself a form of genocidal violence. I'm focusing here on the Armenian genocide, but what I say has very much to do with the way that, as Omar Bartov recently discussed in the New York Times op-ed, most genocide scholars recognize famine in Gaza as a form of genocide, while some historians of the Holocaust would suggest that its very recognition is an anti-Semitic act of denial. It is here, then, that one can ask about the word genocide itself, its usefulness. Back in the 90s, the age of postmodernity in higher academic circles, and here suffice to reduce this to what some of its critics would argue of it, that in the absence of unchanging universals, we're condemned to a bottomless ethical relativism, I attended a conference in my field of study, the continental philosophy of religion, when one scholar's argument profoundly unsettled me, not because he was trying to recuperate the bottomless pit of postmodern relativism, but because of how he did it, invoking the Holocaust as the limit concept of radical evil, unparalleled in the history of humankind by any other. This was genocide, the only one. There's no room for interpretation. Against this, we can measure all trespasses. Radical evil has a measure. It's the unicity of the event that gives it this exceptional status. There are no variations. Nothing else comes close to it. Painting with a broom this otherwise very accomplished argument, this is when I realized I could not let the question of genocide lie. Denial was there in plain sight, not in any malevolent guise, instead in what we might otherwise see as an ethical imperative. The intent is to do good, in solidifying our view of the Holocaust as the one and only historical instance of radical evil. This, then, is how the problem of genocide found its way in my own research studies, and how I come to my second point. Here are a few things I learned early on in my foray. First, the dispute over genocide was also a scholarly dispute about the definition of genocide. Somewhere in the attempt to memorialize abject history and honor its victims, contests over the legitimate use of the term genocide emerged. For some, including the Turkish government heretofore, The fact that the term was invented in 1944 is enough to stipulate that the Armenian massacres were not genocidal and that the crime is not punishable as such. For others, the fact that there were no gas chambers or extermination camps is evidence enough that there was no systematic and organized intent to kill people for who they were as such. There were marches like the Trail of Tears. People died of starvation and disease. Second, though, I learned that the originator of the term, Raphael Lemkin, fought for the criminalization of genocide, and thanks to whom the UN Convention of Genocide exists, meant especially by genocide, cultural genocide. That according to his understanding, as it is still conveyed in the convention, any act that attempts to destroy a people for who they are as such, from mass rape to forced assimilation to physical as well as mental harm, acts that inflict conditions of life calculated to bring about the destruction, partial or not, of the group, these were all acts of genocide. Killing was just one among them. Lemkin believed that defining genocide as a legal crime would lead to the prevention of future genocides, that impunity was a main reason genocide ensued, and that to make this criminalization of genocide effective, one would need to recognize, besides his definition, the fact that genocide had been happening, and they were not just bound up with war. This last fact was essential to ensuring nations could be held accountable for the perpetration of genocide, overriding a key principle of modern international law, the sovereignty of states. Third, I learned not just that the definition of the term was contested, but that its efficacy as a legal concept was contested right from the start. Herr Schlauterpacht was the other Jewish legal behemoth whose critical mind foresaw how the concept of genocide might be used to foment tribalism, and for whom crimes against humanity, not genocide, was the concept worthy of criminalization. Both Lemkin and Lauterpacht's early legal education was at the same university in what is now Ukraine, just a few years apart. Torture, persecution, enslavement, for example, if part of a widespread or systematic attack on civilians, are all acts of crimes against humanity. This is therefore the larger concept. There are practical reasons why crimes against humanity might be a preferable legal concept to genocide. Chief among them is that it may be easier to prove that crimes against humanity have been committed than to prove the intent to destroy in whole or in part a people on the basis of their group identity. For the sake of expedient justice, this may very well be the better weapon against the cycle of violence. At the same time, genocide, while it is a repeatable human tragedy that seems to have visited every corner of the globe, whether in our own backyard or in faraway, distant places we can only name as a continent, conveys something at the heart of people's sense of identity bound up with their concrete existence. My vague Armenianness, for example, a consequence of genocide, does not feel like a choice. While I can ignore it, there's no doubt it has impacted who I am. It's not just some arbitrary quality of my being. It defines it to a certain extent. But this does not give me the right to adjudicate who may or who may not levy the charge of genocide. So to my last point. Long ago, I read an article by an Armenian genocide scholar whose point I didn't understand until more recently. In a nutshell, this scholar suggested that the term genocide was not worth holding on to if it didn't allow us to move forward, to indict perpetrators, and in doing so to prevent other genocides from ever happening. Today, I look at the way that the US government refrains from joining other governments in their condemnation of Israel for its treatment of Palestinians. Whether we call this treatment genocide or not, whether this treatment is defensible because Hamas is itself a terroristic organization whose goal is the genocidal destruction of Israel, children are starving to death, and this is entirely preventable. Today, I also look at the genocide that is happening in Sudan, starvation, rape, torture. Here, we might all agree to use the word, and still we sit unmoved, unconcerned, and complacent, too focused on our own social-political discord. We here today commemorate the victims of 9/11, paradoxically united and at the same time more and more divided and polarized along political lines, more and more wedded to our politics, as if these were very caricatured and carved out political ideologies, as if these were essential to our identity as American citizens. Ready to go to war against a demonized enemy within, we've now painted as the cause of our societal ills. Political scientists warn us that such tensions, together with attempts to solidify the power of the executive branch as sovereign, whether or not because of a state of emergency, are some of the telltale signs that the potential for genocidal violence is on the rise. It is hard to imagine, or is it, that we could become another Rwanda, where neighbors turned on each other and where radio channels played an immense role in inciting violence and hatred. Put our cell phones down, turn down the temperature, teach about civil engagement. Perhaps these are all worthy suggestions. But in the last analysis, we had best become students again, a little less certain about who we are and what we are and are not capable of. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks to the Wellwether Council for the invitation, and thanks to the for the host at this place. And I thank you all for coming to listen to this panel. I learned a lot before I speak, and I'm just glad that I am the last speaker. I'm very glad that because it makes things very easy, okay? And I just want you, like just when I want to talk to you about the specific things about genocide. I am not like a scholar of genocide, but I study situations which were just being affected by when genocide like this happened, okay? So I think it is good like this to follow with you in your analysis and what you are going to hear through just all what has been presented here, starting from the definition of the genocide, what genocide means, talking people think about what genocide like this means, the term itself like this, as the last speaker here just said, and also the internet dimension in how it just aggravates issues with regard to genocide. Okay, so my focus here is at this point here is to talk specifically about a place in which genocide or genocidal acts have been committed. And that is in the place where I'm from Darfur and from Sudan, okay? And just to let you know that like just in genocide, apart from the Holocaust, apart from the Armenian genocide, apart from all those situations which are listed as a genocide, like just in Africa we have maybe, you know, the Rwanda genocide, which just took place in 1994, at a time in which like just close to 1 million people have been killed, okay? It was ethnically based, okay, between two main groups, the Tutsis and the Hutus, okay? And then at the time in which the world was celebrating or being recognizing like just this event, like just happening, the world like just failed the people of Rwanda because there is no intervention from the superpower at the time. The war in Darfur erupted, okay? So erupted on the that anniversary of the genocide, okay? And people thinking that like just never, it will never happen again, but it just happened, okay? And so when we think about genocide in this context here, we have to think about state or government effect or role in creating a condition which is very conducive for suicide. And that is the case, like just even when you think about the Holocaust, it's not like just the Germans going and killing the Jews, okay? But you have to think about the state at that time, to think about the Nazi state which created that. When you think about the Armenian genocide, you have to think about the Turkish government in that providing. And likewise, even in Rwanda, you know, always, when we think about the Rohingyas, you have to think about the Burmese. Okay? So we have just to think about that time and about the role of the state in creating like just this situation. This is a government sponsored by just policy in creating like just this kind of an environment, and in that kind of environment, all those things like just happen. Whether it is a genocide, okay, or sometimes it will be like genocidal acts are just going on, okay. And so follow the definition which you listen to here. I think it is very legitimate for us and right for us also to ask the very concept, okay? When we think about genocide, is it like just in terms like just of numbers, like just how many people have to die so that like just we call that a genocide, okay? How many, why we have like just to think about the genocide is always like just it's between people and not between the government itself. It has a role, okay, in that kind of a killing. When we think, because like the main thing like this, if we follow this legal definition of a genocide, is that about an intent. That must be an intent, okay? And so this intent, there is a lot of issues like this. How can you just prove an intent and not an intent? And that is exactly what happened like this, for example, in Darfur. In the war in Darfur started like this in 2003, okay? The United States sent a commission of inquiry, and then the United States like this was the first country which announced what was happening at that time in Sudan, in Darfur specifically, as a genocide, okay? And then the United Nations in 2004 established like just a commission of inquiry to go to Darfur and to see what was happening, whether it is a genocide or no, and then refer its ruling or the results to the ICC. And that is what they did in 2004, okay? So that commission, when it came out of the report, it said that like just we have been to Darfur, we did our investigation, and when we have seen is that like just there are genocidal acts have been committed, okay? But there is no genocide, because they said like there is no intent, okay? And so based on that, they just refer people, like just they have a list of 35 like just individuals to the ICC, to the International Criminal Court in The Hague, okay? And so up to now, since 2003, there are some indictment. The president of Sudan at that time, he was just being indicted, but of course never been to The Hague, okay? 2 ministers also, they were just being invited, never been to The Hague, okay? And the only one who submitted himself to the ICC was one of those Janjaweed leaders in 2020. And he was just being indicted and he was just being prosecuted. And then the result of that trial will be later in October 6th, the result like just of that, okay? So that is what happened. When we think about the atrocities which were just being committed like just in Sudan, at Darfur, like just in that time, okay? It's horrendous. It is more than 400,000 people just being killed, okay? And of course, when there is this politics also of number, okay? there is all this discrepancy, there is all this kind of variations like this in terms of numbers, okay? There is always like just ways in which for people who are denying like just a genocide or acts like just of mass killings, okay? Under political situations here, people always like just contested by relying on different ill motives of those who giving these numbers, saying that like these numbers are inflated. Those people like just never died, like just from these people died like just from hunger, from other kind of the war, or this is like just a collateral killing. Okay, people just died because of this political, but there is no intent like just of killing people because of who they are. And of course, we are now. Our eyes and our ears are just open for us like just to see whether there is intent or there is no intent in that kind of a killing. So that is what happened like just in Darfur in 2003. That level of violence like just continues apart from this number, because like if we think about that number like just 400,000. The government of Sudan at that time, who was just leading the army against this here, he said like this, what happened, the number of killing like this in Sudan is not like that. This is just like this inflation by those who are our adversaries from the Jewish and Christian groups. It is only 10,000 being killed, okay? It is not like just 400,000. And that is for the mind of some, it's not like just the numbers. It's very important. In the history, like just when we think about the number of violent or so on, when we think about these two small countries in Central Africa, Rwanda and Burundi, okay? Rwandan genocide, which just came in 1994, for 800,000 or close to 1 million, but before that, like just in Burundi, which is just like just south of it here, there are hundreds of thousands of people that just died, okay? But they will never be regarded like just a genocide. When you think about the war, like for example, in Sudan, okay, the civil war like this in Sudan, in which people like just being displaced, people like just sent like just as refugees, people like just died, people like just lost all their belongings or so on, in a kind of a conflict which ranged all the way from 1956 until 2005, okay? Over 2 million people died, okay? So what can you call that, okay? We have just to think about what do we ask about that, like just, is that a genocide? Is that genocidal like just acts like just being committed, as my colleague here said, like just in reference to war crimes or crimes against humanities, which are just being done and continuously are just doing, okay? Can we think about expanding or rethinking about this? Because this is always like just giving a leeway for the states or for governments not to be prosecuted or think just claim that they have nothing to do with what is going on here, because they are just waging a war against an insurgency, okay? And so in that case, civilians died, okay? But when we think about those people who are just being targeted, like just in civil wars, specifically like say for example in Darfur or so on, those who died, and these numbers, these are not numbers of people who are just having guns. These are civilians, okay? When we think about civilians, think about the destruction of their livelihood, destruction of their homes, okay? Destructions of the meager assets which they have, like just their livestock, okay? All the grains which they just have, poisoning of wells, okay? And we have the examples like just throughout since 2003, with that kind of displacement, still people being internally displaced, okay? That is over like just 2 million like just in Sudan, never went back, okay? And then there are also refugees who are just being outside. So this is the situation, and the situation in this context here, it is not like just as we have seen at the beginning, maybe you were not born at that time, like just when activism around the genocide in Sudan was at the highest, and the United States is the main country which is just, people are just talking about Darfur and about Sudan in general, and all those activism and rallies like just in Washington and in New York about this conflict here. So that is the time, okay? That is the time in which like just we have seen like just the focus of the international community like just being directed like just of ending that conflict. And that time it was the conflict like just before other conflicts which just been erupted, before the Rohingyas, before the Iraq War, before Gaza, of course, and before all this other place. But like this, nothing happened. Okay, nothing happened. So there is this impunity for people who like just been involved in this kind of conflict. And in this case here, we have to think about the regime-sponsored kind of policies which make these things like this very right to happen, okay? And then this kind of acts, okay, in which civilians were just being targeted, because it was not like just being addressed satisfactorily, it was not like just being stopped at that time. Now, when you go and see what is going on in Africa or so on, of course it will come to you what is happening now in Sudan, okay? I'm just talking to you now, okay? My whole family were just being displaced out. I mean, the place in which we have just been living all my life. No one is there, okay? Still the war is just going on, okay? And it is not like just a war between the government forces and the rebel movements, okay? It is a war which just like civilians were just being targeted, okay? The latest report which I just found like just yesterday, between January and June, more than almost to 4,000 people in Darfur had just died, okay? When you think about the situation in which like just 14 million, okay, of people like just being displaced outside, you will find them like just now living as refugees in, whether it's in Egypt or in Uganda or in Chad or in Ethiopia, that in addition to the continuous like just destruction of the city and the livelihood of the city, okay? And then you have just to ask yourself like just whether, whose role is that, okay? Whether the role, what is the role of the state, okay, in the ongoing conflict here, okay? When you think about this situation here, it is not new, because again, the history of some countries here, in when there is a movement for people or for groups like just calling for some rights, which they thought they have been not treated like just equally or so on, and especially if it is like just a military act, like just against the state or so on. We see that like just the governments are just always just regard that as a rebellion, okay? And so the only way in which you could just end that is just to end it by violence, okay? And that cycle of violence, it creates its own logic, and it breeds other kind of violence, okay? And one of the things in which we see like just in the history of conflicts here, especially like just in Sudan and maybe in other places here, is the creation of militias, okay? And it is not like just a militia who is like just independent. It is a government-sponsored militia and ethnically based militias, okay? Because if you created like this an ethnically based militias, the main target is not like just those people who are just in opposition to the government, okay? But here you just poisoned all these social relation which has been established within the group, okay? And so you create a ethnic militia which is just poison that kind of a relation, okay? And then the government, with all its might, okay, with all its interest, with all its like just airplanes and with all the logistics it has, okay, will target civilians, okay? And so targeting of civilians throughout the history of, for example, of Sudan or so on, it is one effective way, okay, of fighting an insurgency. And we see that like just today, like the more destruction is happening on a group whom you see, these are the harbingers of the rebel group, like the rebel group from this region, so you have just to go and attack the civilians of this, okay? And so that is the kind of a thing which we have seen throughout. And again, we have just to think about ourselves, what do you call that, okay? What do you call that by just, this is a byproduct of war, okay? When we think about a genocide, whether that also could just lie within that kind of a genocide, whether genocide, when we say genocide, whether it is very restrictive kind of a definition in which like just other acts and other actors who have just been involved in this kind of killing, they will just slip away from our condemnation. I will stop here.
Well, thank you very, very much, Dr. Dinar. Thank you. We have, is this working? Can you guys hear? Yeah. We have had, I think, a pretty comprehensive look at discussion of genocide. It's left me, though, still a little confused. You know, it's perplexing. First of all, I'm not sure how many people have to die before it's genocide. I've heard as little as maybe 10,000 I heard, then I've heard millions. So do we have an agreement on how many civilians, because it can't be just military, it has to be civilians, right, for genocide. How many have to die? Anyone want to tackle that? Okay.
There's only one number in genocide prevention that matters, and it's one. One person who dies from genocide is too many. Legal scholars will say that. But that's the whole point. That's why I'm saying we need the law, and to your beautiful points, genocide isn't the only crime in mass atrocities. We have war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. You could absolutely go blue in the face trying to decide what the crime is and do nothing. So at Bellwether, the number is one. One is too many in any country at any time, and that's why we're working to prevent. With legal definitions, of course, there comes a responsibility. And that's why the political will is pushing away from them. That's why the political will says, oh, it's not genocide. That's why legal scholars say, well, we're not sure, more people have to die. I don't think that's right. I have a moral problem with that. I think the whole point of crime is to enforce human dignity. And if you really care about dignity, what does that mean? It means that there is something inherent, inalienable, beautiful, wonderful about what it means to be a human being, regardless of your identity, regardless of where you were born, regardless of where you're from. If you truly believe in human dignity, then even the loss of one life is too much. And I think that's the most important number for this discussion.
So I get it's one, but honestly, I guess what I'm trying to get, I get morally it's one. But I'm trying to get in this international court situation where the world would rise up and say genocide. Is there a number? Not really,
Yeah,
okay.
I mean,
So I can just say, when thinking about the history of the word, a lot of objections to this word genocide and the definition that then passed in the convention, the Genocide Convention in 1948. A lot of the arguments were about numbers, the numbers problem. And I think, to your point, to quibble, and your point, Dr. Dinar, to quibble over numbers is in itself an extremely dehumanizing act. And maybe this is the issue then with how we talk about genocide.
And I mean, you can talk about, and the other thing that still is gnawing at me from this conversation is this thing of intent. You know, I didn't intend to kill all of you people. you were just there. I mean, how do you prove intent? And who has the intended? The government, or, you know?
Yeah, it's very difficult because no one will self-criminalize himself, okay? And so definitely when it's being asked, I mean, definitely no one will say that like, this is my intention. It is you who at some point you will just make that kind of a decision. And that decision also, it will be politicized, okay? It will be politicized by the other, that like just, okay, you're denying that, but like just you are really, you have that kind of intention. So you have to establish this kind of intention from your own, okay? If you, and that also, yeah, at some situations you will say that like there is intent there, or based on your national interest in that definition, okay? Or at some point you could just reject it, okay? But the bottom line is that there is killing, and as my colleagues say, one is too many.
Yeah, bottom line, there's mass killing of civilians. And from within, it doesn't even have to be from bombing, it could be from starvation, from denial, okay. And the other thing that's still gnawing at me is, and I'm opening it up to you guys to get your questions ready. The thing that's still bothering me a little bit here is let's say we go through all of this, the top determined it's gonna be 10,000, and we determine we know how to do it, we get all of that together, and then nothing happens? Then then, oh well, it happened. Why can't the world do anything about this?
The world doesn't want you to do anything about this. I think I really would like to hear more about Rachel on this and the way in which we could put this in economic terms as a solution, because that would provoke, geopolitical might, if you will.
Rachel, would you comment on that? And also, as you're commenting on that, the sanctions haven't worked too well for Putin.
Yeah, sanctions never work if they're unilateral. That's what the economic data says. So I'm gonna point to a couple of things that I think are the main challenge. Governments don't want to. I do think people want to, but the silent majority exists in every country, and it exists more now that social media pushes the very vocal minority to the front of the news and to the front of our algorithms. So there's always been bystanders to genocide, and many of them do want to stop it, but they don't know how. So I think there's two challenges. There's the warning response gap, which is when the early warning signs start to present in any country. What do we do to respond? That's a major gap. And then there's the information gaps, which is that people who have solutions, organizations like Bellwether, who know what to do, can't scale those solutions fast enough. So what do we do about it? The warning response gap. So that is really where we're trying to build a technology that any person in the world can use, which will say, for example, this is where we're seeing hate speech, it's against these groups. What comes out of our software is a list of recommendations from case studies from other countries, connects you to experts, it connects you to organizations that are trying to do that at scale. So the warning response gap can be filled if we all educate ourselves, and this is where I thought, your comments were so beautiful. We need to be students of genocide prevention, each of us. And even now I'm thinking about, okay, how do we scale this conversation we've had? We need influencers who get on TikTok and talk seriously about genocide and talk seriously about how it happens. And if we all understood and were talking about these things, I do think we'd see prevention at scale. So the first part, the warning response gap, which we're trying to fill. The second part is the information failures. So that's where I keep saying the word at scale, at scale, at scale. We have millions and millions of nonprofits doing very similar work, but there's information gaps. There are people who are doing the exact same projects in different countries and they don't talk to each other. So this is where economics becomes, in my opinion, the tool to stop genocide. Economics is all about changing inefficiencies to increase an outcome at scale. This is why people love economists, because they're mostly thinking about inefficiencies for profit. Well, I'm thinking about inefficiencies for protecting human lives. Let's think about where there's information available, education available, resources, even funding. People tell me all the time, oh, well, if we had more money, we could stop genocide. That is such a poor excuse. There's so much money in the world. There's more money in the world than there's ever been. And there actually are good people who want to give it, but there's information failures. They don't know where to give their money to scale these kinds of resources. So that is the second challenge that we're going to address. And to make this concrete and pragmatic, I want each of you to hold me accountable. I want each of you to follow Bellwether's work. And if I don't do what I've said I'm going to do in the next 5 years, I want you to pick up the phone and call me or send me a DM or contact one of these speakers. I'm going to do it. I'm committed to doing this. We know how to do it. We have more information than we've ever had. We have had more resources than we've ever had. And each of us can be part of that movement. Truly, it may sound cliche, but you can become part of our movement to close the warning response gap, step 1, and to correct the information failures, step 2. And then I truly do believe, and maybe I'm a naive American, and maybe I'm a naive optimist, I've heard every challenge in the book, but I'm not convinced we've tried to stop genocide at scale. I'm not convinced we've really tried. The last real effort to stop genocide at scale was the UN Convention on Genocide Prevention in 1948. 1948! I mean, that's almost 100 years ago. So I'm going to try to do this over the course of the next 10 years, and you can be part of the journey, and you can hold me accountable, but I think we're going to do it. At a minimum, here's my promise, here's my indicator of success. We're going to decrease the global trend towards genocide. So it's happening every 2.5 years now. If we're successful, that trend will decrease, and we'll see significantly less genocide in the world than we do now.
Wow, that is so inspiring. It really is. I think we're going to take it, so get your hand. All right, there's one back there.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
I'm just about this question about what we are supposed to do, like just when this thing happens. Okay, there is a political commitment which just happened and endorsed in 2005 by the United Nations. It's called responsibility to protect. So the responsibility to protect is not just similar to what happened just in Sudan, in Darfur specifically, in 2003, and nothing happened. In Rwanda, 1994, no one came to save them. That whenever something like this happens like this, the international community has to intervene to protect civilians, okay? But of course, just to protect civilians also is a political act, okay? So it is just in the paper. And we didn't see that just happening in atrocities which committed after 2003.
I think there's a question back there. Okay.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
I want first to say thank you for the World Affairs Council for doing this amazing and timely symposium, and I'm going to join you. And I encourage everybody to join because that's how we need to be engaged. And thank you for at last bringing somebody to talk about the genocide in Sudan, because that's a genocide that we are almost ignoring. As a Palestinian American whose parents were ethnically cleansed in 1948, I am intimately associated with what's happening now. So I have a couple of questions. One for Noëlle. You talked that Hamas is a terrorist organization, which is, the United States says they are a terrorist organization. You said that they want to erase all Jews. And I'm assuming you've never read their charter, because actually Hamas accepted the two-state solution. So if you accept two-state solution, it means that you are not in the charter saying that we want to kill all Jews. So just, since we hear that,
Yes,
let me finish, and then you can answer, if you don't mind, just so that I can get. For Hannah, thank you very much. We met in the parking lot, and I appreciate what you are doing. My question is, being that you are a scholar of the Holocaust, and given that, well, first of all, let me I'm surprised, though, that given the Holocaust or the genocide that's happening in Gaza, that there is no Palestinian on the panel. And that's actually a continued erasure of the Palestinians. We never see Palestinians represented to talk about their own experience. Well, I'm not on the panel. I mean, I came, right? It's different. It's different. Yeah. And I've been in the past 2 years. I mean, since January 2014, the ICJ said it's a plausible genocide. Recently, B'Tselem, which is an Israeli human rights organization, said it's a genocide. They called it our genocide. The 80% of genocide scholars said it's a genocide. This week, the UN said it's a genocide. So I think we need to stop, dancing and say it's a genocide. Call it what it is.
So let's let them respond.
Yeah. So my question.
Because other people have questions. So
Yeah. I'm sorry.
You've answered 3. That's enough.
I just have a question. So
Well,
what's
one
the
more, but we have
difference?
to move on.
What's the difference between the Holocaust and genocide? I just want to understand that. Thank you.
Thank you. Go ahead, who wants to take the first one?
Simply about my comment in my talk was speaking specifically to the way in which this issue is polarized, and in being polarized, we are unable to take a stand, correct? So there is a famine and there is genocide in Gaza, right? The comment that I spoke to, that rightfully so don't like, is the way in which in our orbit we hear things talked about. So that is perhaps what.
Oh, it's not that I don't like. I'm correcting.
I think let's let them go through, but I think the point she was making, and we really all want to hear that since I spent decades covering the Israeli-Palestinian dispute, is that our categorization of an organization like Hamas, which has done terrible things, is seen differently in their society. They're seen as defenders. They're seen as people who've stepped up to try to help them. In our society, we're on the other side. They're seen as aggressors. So just so we understand, that's what she's trying to say. Our perception of terrorism can be different where we are in the world.
Thank you.
Let me just first say that it takes enormous courage to come to this event. It takes enormous courage to share your comments, and we thank you. Anyone who's organized any panel, maybe you've had experiences organizing a panel. I'll just share a brief story of an experience I had. I was trying to organize a panel about global conflict. I asked many people to join. I asked women to join. I ended up with a panel of people that I did not really ask the first round or second round or third round, and I hope we're not the third round. We might be the third round panelists that were asked to speak. But just because there's not a panelist from Palestine does not mean that we're erasing you. And all of us acknowledged that Palestine is genocide. I think every single one of us acknowledged that. But I hear your point. Your point is that there needs to be more. So let me just validate that. There does need to be more. We need to stop genocide. We need to also respond. Now that genocide is happening, who is going to rebuild Palestine? Who's going to stand up for all these things? So what I'd like to invite you to do is speak with us after this panel, because you have many constructive ideas. All of us are happy to hear your ideas. And for all of us, remember that solidarity is one of the ways that we enforce human dignity. It's important to stand in solidarity with all people, regardless of who's suffering, and to disagree with them, and to disagree respectfully, right? What's happening in Palestine is about decisions that are being made by the Israeli government, but it's not about Jews. It's not about Jews. So she didn't say that, we didn't say that. This is one of the biggest arguments, and yet what we've modeled in this moment, which I again appreciate, is that we can stand in solidarity with people who are suffering. And if we learn to listen and validate, then the very hardest discussions in our society actually become about something which we share in common, which is that this wonderful woman wants to go home to her family and see less suffering in the world, and I want to go home to my family and see less suffering in the world. That's how we do this. That's how we talk about difficult conversations in our society. So thank you again, and happy to speak with you after the panel.
I'd just like to respond really briefly. A few weeks ago, when talking about the Armenian genocide, a student said, in response to the denial that genocide was happening at that time, she said, but at that time they didn't have documentation. Like, there were some photographs and there were some accounts, but it wasn't for sure. Now we know what's going on. And she said, we have the images from Gaza. We know what's going on. And some of the students in the class responded to that saying, it seems even more confusing than ever, and we don't know what to believe. And I think this is exactly the reason. And I don't have a solution other than to that simplistic, we need to examine the language that is creating our worlds, which is a response to this, which is like people in the past, in the Holocaust, they should have had human rights, but somehow we don't see that people in the present need it. So it's words. Yeah, it's an inadequate response, but
Yeah, so it's Holocaust and
So we have another
genocide.
question here, and then we'll come back.
Yes.
Thank you, panel. I want you to help me to understand one thing. I cannot understand, I try very hard, that how a group or groups that they have experienced Holocaust or genocide, however they want to classify it, when they get opportunity, they do that also. That blows my mind. I hope you can fix it for me. Thank you.
Well, on another level, yeah, please do it. They do say people who are abused as children go on to abuse children.
Well, let's start with the data. So one of the number one drivers of genocide in the world is grievance. It's trauma. And let's talk about the neuroscience of trauma. When you are in a state of trauma, your frontal lobe, which makes all the decisions, pragmatically, rationally, your frontal lobe is flooded with hormones. So what happens to your decision-making process if you're in a state of trauma? You have three options. You've probably heard them. Fight, flight, or freeze. So what happens if a nation has experienced genocide? And I think especially our panelists who have ties to genocidal nations, thank you so much for your stories. Like, these are the most important perspectives in my mind. They just told you there's something in their bones. Trauma is transmissible. Trauma is passed down from generation to generation. So if you have a community that's experienced genocide, and that trauma is unhealed, and those grievances are inherited, then it's really hard to come out of these cycles of genocide. It's really hard to make pragmatic, rational decisions. I'm not saying people who have trauma are irrational, okay, so let's be clear, we all have trauma, and that's not what I'm saying. But I'm saying that societally, we don't really have tools to heal trauma. We have therapy in the United States, but a therapy approach in the global north doesn't equate to trauma healing in the world, right? We gotta look at the science, we have to look at the neuroscience. So if we're gonna disrupt cycles of genocide, we have to think about healing trauma. We have to think about healing grievances. And you're absolutely right. There is something so jarring. This is why sexual abuse scandals in the Catholic Church always make the front page. There's something so jarring about having an expectation of morality, whether it's a religious group or a religious leader or a nation that's experienced genocide, and then something bad happens. Now the expectation gap of, wait a minute, we expected you to know better or do better, makes the consequence even more jarring, even though the consequence is the same for all groups. Evil is evil. No group has a monopoly on evil. Bad decisions are made in every institution by many governments in the world. So you've pointed to that. You've pointed to that emotional reaction we have when we're like, wait a second, the United States, how could they do that? Because there's an expectation. How could Germany do that? There's an expectation. How could fill-in-the-blank government do that? So let's all think about trauma in our own lives as another way to disrupt the cycle. When you take care of your trauma, your family trauma, your inherited trauma, you become part of the solution for peace. And I mean that. It's really important that we all do that in our lives.
Thank you very much for your intervention, and thank you for enlightening me for Armenia and other genocide that I didn't know. I will just go back a little bit, and I have two questions. My first question is, the genocide definition that came from the United Nations, is it only applied after the 19th or the 18th century, or is it applied to before? That's my first question. And my second question is, even if, why is the most important genocide that's called MAFA, or the African genocide, that was in the context of transatlantic slavery, is undermined? It's going a little bit in the same context that we are speaking right now, that every genocide is a crime. So why is that genocide kind of undermined when it's the biggest one? And the definition of genocide does not consider that. And going to the fact that you say genocide started with one person, that means it was a genocide and more genocide during those 4 centuries during transatlantic slavery. So I just want to know why. I appreciate the one Black History Month that we celebrate, but that goes more in history, celebrating people that fight against slavery. But it doesn't really address the genocide that happened during those 4 centuries. So I would like some enlightening.
Let me answer, and then I think there was someone over there.
So I can just briefly, again, to the history of the Genocide Convention. Raphael Lemkin, when persuading nations to sign on to the Genocide Convention so that it could be ratified by the United Nations, one of the persuasions that he used was to assure them that punishment would not be retroactive. So this also played a role in the eventual ratification by the US, which didn't happen until the 1980s. And people in the US, the Southern senators, said, we are going to be charged with genocide for our treatment of Black Americans. And this fear of retroactive justice was a great barrier both for members of the UN to signing the convention as well as to eventual watered down passage in the US.
I just wanted to add that in the 1950s, there was a petition that was placed before the UN for genocide of African Americans. And some of the charges having to do with the Jim Crow era, but also others having to do with slavery and the slave trade. But for the reasons this panel here explained, the charge was not taken up. So it's there, you can read about it. You have people like W.E.B. Du Bois who presented it even.
It's still on our 30 acres and a mule, so don't.
Thank you. Thank you. Before I ask my question, could I get a operational definition of the word disrupting from the board, which everyone agrees on unanimously, please?
This is a great challenge. Thanks for your question. I don't know if we agree on a definition of disrupting, but I think we're trying to create a model of disrupting. So I like the word disrupting, and we chose the word disrupting for this panel because it comes directly from Bellwether's mission statement, which is to disrupt the cycle of genocide and create genocide-resistant societies. So you have to disrupt and resist. I think in my mind, what we're trying to do as an organization is actually put together a toolkit, which we're publishing it later this year, about what it means to disrupt. What does it mean at a local level, a national level, and an international level? So let me send that to you and to anyone else who's interested. When that is published at the end of the year, we'll share that, and I'd love your feedback if you have ideas for us.
All right, I'll proceed with my question now. I don't think I need the mic.
No, please do, please.
I do?
Recording.
Okay, I understand. My question is specifically for you, Mrs. Miner. However, I'd be interested to hear from any member of the council who would have an answer. You stated that your working definition for genocide was the intent to destroy in whole or in part a group based on ethnicity, nationality, race, or religion, and that genocide is completely predictable and entirely unavoidable. However, I've heard varying definitions of genocide from every member without a clear and decisive plan besides that of your undefined economic approach, Mrs. Miner. I personally agreed with Dr. Dinar's questionable definition of genocide the most. However, if we can't have an operational and universal measurement of genocide, how can we consider preventing genocide? And furthermore, if distinguished scholars such as yourself can't come together and agree on a singular definition of genocide, how can initiatives be considered for an unclearly defined issue?
You should study law. You should study law. Okay, there we go. You'd be formidable in a courtroom. I feel like I'm in a courtroom right now, so let me respond to the jury. First, thank you for the question. It's not my definition. It's the UN Convention on the Prevention of Genocide. That is the universal definition. That is the working definition. That is what all practitioners and academics work from. My comment specifically was that it is, in my words, working. I think there's more work to be done, and it doesn't work. So it's a starting point. It's working well enough that there's an entire panel having this conversation and using the definition. I'm saying, to your point exactly, I think we're in complete agreement here. We have a lot of work to do. And I'll just say on a very personal note, I started Bellwether in 2019, December of 2019, so we're not even 6 years old yet as an organization. What keeps me up at night is that I can't work fast enough. What's an absolute challenge on every level, physically, mentally, emotionally, is that I go to these panels and genocide is happening in real time and people are saying to me constantly, why aren't you stopping it? My challenge in real time is that this is truly, in my opinion, the greatest challenge of our world, of this century. It's the most violent challenge of our century, and there's just massive, massive barriers to getting more people involved in this work. So I take your point. As an academic, I'm grateful for the challenge, but as an individual, as a human being, you've just touched on the most personal part of my work, which is I'm not doing enough, and I don't think any of us are doing enough. And every day I have the decision to stay in bed absolutely paralyzed by the scale of this problem, or to get out of bed and do what I can with my blessings, with my privilege, with my sphere of influence. And again, I reiterate, I don't have all the answers. I don't have a silver bullet. Bellwether is not the global answer, and certainly I wasn't trying to portray that. But what I'm trying to portray is that I get out of bed every morning and I am committed to this. I am committed to this, and I'm not afraid to be held accountable for what we haven't or haven't done. And I'm also not afraid to be recognized as someone who is trying with everything she has, with all of her resources, with her network, to do something meaningful about this problem. So thank you so much for your question. I appreciate
And just
that.
to defend you a little, none of this would be happening were it not for your support. So that's true.
Okay, just follow up to the question here you asked about disrupting the cycle of genocide. I think, I think for me, disrupting the cycle of genocide, if we want to disrupt that, we have to disrupt or to cut or to change that environment which was just very conducive for the genocide to take place. I think without addressing that, like just we always like just have genocide. And as I said, like just from history, all these acts of genocide or this kind of violence, like just against civilians, it has an environment, and that environment is always like just being nurtured by an ideology of the state. So unless that has changed, we would be just in continuous cycle of acts. We would call them genocide, we would call them like just others.
Could I ask you a follow-up on that?
Well, I think it's important to, yes, you can dance about it, but I think it's important that we hear what he's saying. This is part of disrupting the cycle of genocide. Our sitting here today, learning about it, talking about it, realizing sometimes that atmosphere that allows genocide comes from the top, comes from a government. And that should be disrupted, it should not be allowed. But at this level, just human beings, we can disrupt it. We can be nice to each other in asking our questions.
Yes.
I liked your point that we should be cutting or changing the environment where genocide takes place, but whose job should that be? Should that be independent groups such as Dr. or Mrs. Miner's group, or should it be governments who come in and like set this? And then who should decide that? Where should this all originate from?
I think that would be like this, it's collective, okay? It is a collective, it is people, it is regional organizations, it is international organizations, okay? Which like just put immense pressure on these kind of policies that they have, it has to be changed. And we have seen that like just in many places in which the international community exerted pressure, we see changes. And that is why we have like say the United Nations body, all these organs here. It is one kind of a pressure, okay? When we think about the International Criminal Court, it is a kind of a pressure for these kind of acts like this not to take place, and then perpetrators will have their time in court. So it is a collective effort, okay?
So it takes everyone, the government, individuals, non-profit organizations like ours working. Yes, someone who hasn't had a chance to talk.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for the great points of information that you all brought today. I really appreciate your questions, and I think like for me from a personal standpoint, as someone that is from Darfur, Sudan, and that's read up on a lot of other genocides, I can say that I'm just very fed up with people in general, with government specifically, and I feel like to the point where why can't we hold large governments responsible, because their inaction is leading to the continuation and the actions of genocide. For instance, like something as very recent with regards to what's happening in Palestine, where you have countries that are voting against any sort of action that can be taken to reach a ceasefire agreement. Why can't we take an extra step and reach out to the ICC and say, hey, you know, like these governments, they don't want to support this, even though based on the definition, genocide is taking place here. Same thing with regards to what's happening in Darfur. Like, yes, a genocide is happening. And for those who were involved or knew about the Darfur genocide back in 2004, there was the Enough Project, and the whole chant that we kept on saying at every single rally, never again, never again. And one, it never stopped, just for clarification. It continued from 2003 onwards. That's why we say it's 20 years plus that people from Darfur have been experiencing a genocide. And now it's just like more heightened with what's happening in terms of Sudan as a whole. But even so, there's no actual action that's being taken by like the international community or governments. So at what point can we as a whole just say like, hey, like large countries, like first world countries that you think you're so great because you don't have genocides in your countries, everything is going well, when can we hold you responsible for taking action in UN-based like organizations or whatever and saying like stopping or abstaining or actually voting no against legislation that would actually lead to some sort of ceasefire or help to the people who are going through genocide? Thank you.
I think the bottom line is why can't these international organizations really do something to stop this? And is there something wrong with the system that allows one country to veto everything?
Yeah, let's make it personal, let's make it local. In some countries, there are not choices about who ends up in government, and so then in a lot of ways the choices of government are separate from the people. In this country, no, but I'm serious. We are at a major inflection point in the United States where people, both have forgotten the lessons of the recent past about what it means to sacrifice for democracy and what it takes to maintain one. Listen, y'all, this is the messiest form of government in the world. It's messy. It's messy because we want representation. And if it's messy, it's going to require a lot of work, not once a year in November when I go to the polls. That is lazy democracy. I'm going to say it. It's lazy democracy. And it's not good enough anymore. Not in a world where morals and values are not really part of the mainstream conversations. Not when we are polarized. Maybe not as polarized as we've ever been, because to your point, there was a civil war in this country around slavery. There was a civil rights movement. I'm actually saying we need to go back and learn from Martin Luther King, from W.E.B. Du Bois, from all these people who modeled what not lazy democracy looks like, engaged democracy looks like. That was not that long ago. People were being bombed in their churches. Black people were being lynched. That's still happening, but I'm saying that time where we could learn about how to hold an entire government responsible, arguably the United States, how do we hold the entire US government responsible? People have done this. We need to learn from them. We need to learn from them and then do it. And it's going to require you to be uncomfortable. You're going to have to go to the caucus meeting, even though you have 3 kids that are playing a soccer game at the same time. Criticize. It is so easy to criticize. My challenge for you, in addition to the other invitations I've left, if you criticize, you must then contribute. If we live in a world that only criticizes, we're not really going to be any better off than we've ever been. But when you criticize, you contribute. If you've got a problem, you contribute. And in that way, we will see change. We can hold entire governments responsible. Other countries have done it. This country has done it. I always think about, there's an amazing documentary I'll recommend to you, Pray the Devil Back to Hell. It's about a group of mothers that single-handedly stopped the civil war in Liberia and elected the first female president of Africa. We can do this, but we've got to be willing to engage, sacrifice, be very uncomfortable, be very busy. We've got to sacrifice. That's the reality. We've got to sacrifice for the things we value.
And most of us aren't even lazy in our democracy. We don't even vote. Most of us don't go to the polls, right? I think we have time for one question before I do closing. All right, I'll do 2. But wait, you had a chance. I'm going to do this and this, okay? And then you can talk to them afterwards, all right? We just want to be democratic here. You, and then I'll come to you.
Hello and good morning to everyone on the board. This is an open-ended question. This is an open-ended question for everyone that's sitting. I just wanted to know what you think the youth should do, aside from being aware of the genocides that are happening. How can we also contribute to supporting those people that are going through it?
And where was the other?
Right here. First of all, thank you guys for coming here. What are ways that international law or the people can do to put pressure to stop the genocide happening in Gaza and Palestine altogether that we have seen streamed on our phones and everywhere in your views as it is devastating? Why can't they be held accountable? Why are we seeing impunity from the Israeli government?
Okay, that's closing remarks from everyone.
Okay, so it's just about the youth, okay? I think like just you have a lot of things to do. Part of it is like just to be very proactive, attending events like this, educating yourself about it, okay? Writing to your constituency at local levels, federal level, okay? And then like just see other organizations like just which you could just join and things like I have known this like during the Darfur conflict, okay, and it is very educational, and it is not like just educational to the masses, but also with that kind of education there is acts which force the government also to be engaged, okay, and so you have a power in your hand, okay. I don't see like just at times like just that power is always there, and then the government always react to that. But if the government has an interest, and the youth and every individual just get involved in that kind of pressure at the end it will just produce something very fruitful and something which led to the end of violence. Okay, not even in a distant place. Okay, just when the conflict in Darfur happened, and we have seen these rallies, million marches, just in Washington and in New York. I mean, that is a big force, just a force not only for the U.S. government, okay, but also a force for the United Nations to be more active and to be more engaged, okay. And so it works. And so I think just your voice, your acts, always this happen. Even you. This tiny one also, your presence here, it helps. Thank you.
To disrupt violence today, we also need to recognize what happened yesterday. I think that starts with learning as today or in your classrooms. At the same time, I just wanted to note again that to prosecute genocide or to prosecute such acts of violence may require we disengage ourselves from holding on to the past.
What to do, of course, this is the thing. And this is when we were asked to write a few remarks to present about disrupting the cycle of genocide. Actually, I wanted to say no, because of the difficulty of the question. So I think I just say two things, and it's about what should the youth do, what should we all do, and I don't think it's anything profound, because we all have some of these same questions, but I think in this country, and a lot of other people think this, I'm sure all of you do here too, we've got to communicate with people who have different beliefs than us. We've got to be friends with each other. We've got to communicate our experiences, the things that we've learned, that we understand, and communicate them in conversation to people who have learned and experienced different things. It's a cliche to say this, but we have to do it. And I think a second thing, maybe this might more seem obviously for youth, but it's also for all of us. When we read, when we learn, and we learn in long form way, when we read books or long articles, we really learn and we really understand, and we are changed by that. This is something that I think I don't think I understood when I was a student, that actually learning is about changing. So I have a book recommendation in true annoying teacher fashion. It doesn't take us into the present moment, but to wrestle with these questions of why doesn't the international system work? How did we come to this place? Samantha Power's A Problem from Hell, America and the Age of Genocide is a starting point to understanding it, to understanding why we're where we are.
Could you repeat that again?
Yeah. Sure. A Problem from Hell, America and the Age of Genocide. The writer is Samantha Powers. Excuse me, Power, Samantha Power.
Thank you.
Great, it's a great book. She's written others, but she did win the Pulitzer Prize for that book. She was a journalist in Srebrenica as the genocide was happening, and that's kind of where her journey began. Very powerful. Okay, let's think about 3 specific things you can do today. Anybody have one of these by chance? Okay, 3 things. Here we go. When you call your senator or representative, they have to log every single call into their system. How do I know this? Because I had to do it. Because I worked on the Hill. And every single call, every voicemail, every email, every letter I had to manually put into the system. So if you think it doesn't really matter, it actually really does. And if you scheduled into your day, maybe you have a commute to work, maybe you drive to school, maybe you walk to school, maybe you do something. It takes about 2 minutes to call someone. It's going to ring for about 10 to 20 seconds. They are either going to answer or not. You're then going to share, hey, I'm really upset about what's happening in Sudan. I'm really upset about what's happening in Palestine. Can you please let my representative know that I'd like them to represent me? That I'd like them to represent these issues? Or here's my personal connection. Make sure you say this, I'm a constituent of this area. And then you hang up the phone. 2 minutes. I'm not kidding. It's a 2-minute activity. Every single person in this room could do it today. I like to just build it into my routines. I'm not kidding. Hey, today I would like my representatives to know I'm really not okay with this. Or next day, hey, I'd really like my representatives to know, that was awesome. Thank you for voting on that. Do that again. I'm rewarding good behavior. Well done. Just make a quick phone call. Number 2, social media, whether we like it or not, has enormous influence. Enormous influence. You can follow organizations, you can share their content, you can post from your feeds, and do it in a way with respect. That makes as big a difference as anything. Not just what you share, how you share it matters more than ever, particularly in this country. So share with respect. Hey, I'm a human being. I'd like to share something about how I feel. This is how I feel. Send me a text if you want to talk about it. Send me a text. Let's talk about it in a kind and respectful way. Those are 2 things. Number 3, we do accept volunteers. As I mentioned, we are trying to scale as fast as we can. You can give time, you can give talent, you can give donations. That sounds hollow cliche. It's not. I'm not living in a penthouse. I'm here with you, talking about the issues that really matter. I really am a sincere person trying to do the right things for the right reasons. And you can give, 4th thing, your ideas. Okay? Remember about that point? Criticize, then contribute. If we haven't stopped genocide yet, it could be the warning response gap, or it could be the information failures. If you have ideas, if you have information, if you know about other organizations we should partner with, if you know about World Affairs Councils, if you know donors, share your ideas, help close those information gaps. Those are 3 things every single person in this room today could do, and I'm going to do them as well. So thanks for the reminder.